So we are starting our first sub area of philosophy. And we're starting with, like I mentioned, what I think is probably the most interesting one to, the most people. And so there's a lot of stuff that, is going on behind the scenes that we're going to unpack, but it's a really fun sort of entry point. So just something interesting, a question that you have about something from this week's content. So again, please share with a neighbor, right? If you're in person or if you're able to type it in the chat. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to share your question. And Aiden, I guess if you have a question and you're willing to share it verbally, you could do that, but no pressure. So Fig, hopefully you're able to take a second to type up your answer in the chat. With us online. Molly, feel free to turn on your camera and type your question in the chat. And then Hannah, are you available again on your end? Hannah? She's good. Okay. Oh, awesome. Okay, cool. We got one from Fig. Okay, so Hannah, when you guys are ready on your end, oh, she's back. There she is. Hi, Hannah. When you're ready, if you could get a couple of questions to share from the students on your end. When you're ready, I'm going to pull from the students who are participating individually first. All right, so great. We've got a couple here. Participants here so I can see everybody. Great. No problem, Hannah. Okay, so Fig, what began the pursuit for knowledge, an event or by choice? Good, interesting question. Are you thinking here in terms of like the beginnings of philosophy, or can you say a little bit more about your question? It seemed like a sort of broader question about philosophy, but I actually think it ties in really well to religion. I can't say, I'm not an anthropologist. I can't say like the beginnings of markers of like higher forms of intelligence, right, in human beings, and like when we maybe started asking questions about where we came from. But from what I understand about the like art and the markings that, ancient peoples use to record things, it seems like those kinds of questions have been around since language has been around, right? Since we've sort of any sort of questions that we sort of ask about the world typically always tend to involve something about us needing to understand our place within it, right? And so it makes sense that over time, right, as humans understand more and more of the world, our understanding would need to include explanations for why all of those things around us are there as well, right? So why are we here? Why are all these elements here? And certainly as we start to, navigate the stars, navigate space and the universe, those explanations need to get grander. And so what we see throughout history is an interesting sort of mark where the further back you go, the more of a chaotic sort of narrative early humans had for explaining things, which is why you don't see a singular sort of divine God come up in anyone's explanation until much later on in human history. So if you have any sort of divine entities in early human stories and mythology and explanations and theories, it's many of them, and they're often in animalistic depictions, right? So prescribing supernatural explanations to things that we already had some sort of idea of what they were in the physical world. And so as human knowledge sort of progresses, and as we start moving towards a more, what we might now consider to be like a scientific understanding of the universe, we start to see over time people sort of switch gears and come up with simpler and simpler understandings for things, right? And so over time, that meant going from many gods to a single god, and then perhaps not needing a god at all, right, to explain why we're here and where we come from. But from what I understand, I would say that those questions have been around since the beginning. And, maybe that goes to my philosopher's spirit, right? I think that engaging in philosophical inquiry is a very human activity. I think that's something that we're all inclined to do. Again, maybe society might teach us to stop asking questions, right? We talked about that a little bit the first week, but in general, seems to be something that has always been there. Okay. How many, Molly, good question. How many philosophers have died trying to question religion? Um, I'm sure many more than I even know. So the famous one, right, that you read a little bit about in week one was the trial and death of Socrates. Can anyone remember what were the three charges? So we talked a little bit about the fact that he was charged with corrupting the youth. That's the philosophy part. But does anyone remember the other two charges? One of them in particular is going to be related to religion. Anyone? Hannah, anyone on your end know? Yes, basically the equivalent of heresy, right? And so the dominant religious traditions at that time would have been what we know as, Greek mythology, right? So the traditional pantheon of gods, Zeus, right? And all of the sub deities. I don't know if any of you have seen like the Hercules or Xena type stories, right? But these are all based off of mythical characters that are actually part of the Greek religious tradition, right? So these were real gods. They had real temples, and real people worshipped them for a very long time. And so there is some debate about whether or not Socrates even was religious, because he doesn't talk about God. But when he talks about, this is something that we're going to get to when we get to epistemology and the theory of knowledge, but something that is very famous for Plato and Socrates is known as the allegory of the cave. Maybe some of you have heard of it already. It's this sort of hypothetical scenario where you imagine a bunch of people who are trapped in a cave and they're looking at shadows on the walls and they think the shadows are real. So again, we'll get to it, but maybe some of you have already heard of it. But the idea there is that as you leave the cave, you go out into the sun, and the sun in the allegory of the cave is representing something real for Plato and Socrates, which is called the form of the good. And a lot of philosophers think this might have a sort of like deistic quality. It's not anthropomorphized in the way that we're familiar with God, in the sense that the Plato and Socrates wouldn't have made anything human about this concept, right? They wouldn't have given it any sort of human characteristics. That's what anthropomorphize means. So, certainly wouldn't have a human body, wouldn't have human characteristics, right? We wouldn't describe it in that way. But at the time, even postulating a single entity from which everything else created was basically the equivalent of heresy, right? At a time when it was seen that there were many gods, right? Each responsible for their specific domain of creation and ruling the world. So one of the three charges for Socrates technically was a form of religious sort of persecution, and that he was not upholding the dominant religion at the time. There are a lot more examples of natural philosophers being put to death for their challenging of what was seen as dominant religious doctrine at the time, but this ends up being tangential. Like, it's not so much that the natural philosophers or scientists were disproving something in the Bible, or directly saying that something was false or that there wasn't a God. Like, oftentimes a lot of these people who were put to death were themselves theists, and were in fact monotheists, and many times were in fact Christian, right? But it's that they were putting forth a theory that threatened something about the unique special status of humanity, right? And so the classic example of this is, does anyone know who is responsible for us switching from a geocentric to a heliocentric model of the universe? So the difference from thinking that the Earth is the center of the universe, or of our galaxy, right? The universe, that was as big as our mind was back then, to the sun being the center. Anyone know who was responsible for this paradigm shift? Different way of... Oh no, where's our science history at? Galileo, good, thank you. All right, yes, Galileo is very famously known for this. And so Galileo was not, disproving anything about Christianity, but by merely implying that humans were not the center of the universe anymore. This was seen as a threat to Christian creation, right? In that, human beings as the primary creation of God tends to be a very large basis around what a lot of the Christian narrative is centered. And so it raises a lot of questions like, why did God create us, right? So if we are not the center of the universe and everything does not actually literally revolve. We use that as sort of a phrase now, like for people who are arrogant, right? Like the earth doesn't revolve, or the system doesn't revolve around you. That's where this comes from, right? That's where that saying comes from. It's because we literally used to think that everything revolved around us, right? That we were the absolute center of the entire universe. And so switching away from that led to questions about why God or a being would create us, which gets to what we're talking about this week, right? Are going to be not just sorts of questions about what type of God exists, but whether or not even a God could exist, right? And so that's going to be the big difference between, again, what we're doing in philosophy and what you might see in some theology studies, right? So a lot of people who study religion from within a particular religion will be asking these same questions, right? But they would be using, say, biblical or sacred texts to answer those questions. Now, why are we not going to be doing that as philosophers, given what we learned last week? Can anyone guess why we wouldn't be using scripture this week when we're having our conversations about God? Sort of antithetical to most conversations about God. What might scripture already presume is true? God. Yes. Very good. Right? So when we're looking at religious scripture, the reason that philosophers will not be using any of this as evidence, right, or reason or justification in support of their arguments is that, exactly right, Lunaria, these already presume that they're not just a God, but that their God exists, right? And in philosophy, remember, we don't start from presumptions, right? We are working backwards to try to question the things that we are already presuming to be true. Okay, so if you use scripture to argue for the existence of the God presumed by that scripture to already exist, that's an example of what we would call circular reasoning, right? So you're already assuming the thing I'm trying to prove. If I'm trying to prove that God exists in my conclusion, right? I can't then assume that God's existence as one of the premises to then prove God's existence, right? And so using scripture would do that, right? So again, it's not that that's another conversation, what role scripture is going to play, right, in knowledge and religious life. And there are many rich philosophical discussions we can have about that. But the point is, again, we're just not going to be using that as premises, right, reasons to establish. And you're going to see the same thing with the philosophers we're looking at this week. But again, this doesn't mean that these philosophers aren't themselves religious. Pretty much all of them come from the Abrahamic traditions, right? And so these are theists. These are monotheists who are arguing for the existence of God so that they can eventually argue for the existence of their specific conception of God, right? Which is going to have a unique set of attributes, right? All right. So, Hannah, can you share at least one question from your students that they had?
Well, I'm talking to them. We went through Anthony's first lecture yesterday on teleological and cosmological arguments. I'm just hoping they can pull something from that discussion.
Okay, well, that's
about Paley and Aquinas and the objections and
yeah, no, good. Okay, so this brings us to something else again, right, that is going to be important for our class, which is new terminology, right? So you're getting a lot of new terms this week, and the basic idea is to help you understand how to categorize different types of arguments, right? So there's going to be lots of different types of arguments for God's existence. Most of these arguments, to get at Lunaria's question, are going to be from primarily monotheistic religious traditions. And the reason for that is that they tended to have historically the highest stakes or the highest urgency in needing to prove this case, right? So you don't tend to see a lot of historical pushback to polytheistic religious traditions, since those tend to be some of the first ones that we see emerge throughout the ancient world. And so it's not like they had competition, right? The polytheists didn't have competition when they emerged on the scene, whereas monotheistic traditions came later in human history and so had to fight, had to compete with the polytheistic traditions. And so you tend to see more of an impetus in the monotheistic traditions to argue that there's only a single God rather than many gods. And that's going to be really important for us this week, because one of the common issues that we're going to find philosophically in pretty much all of these arguments are what I like to call, I forget what I called it before, but I tend to call it something like the theistic jump, which is their arguments will lead to the existence of some type of necessary being. And we can review what that word necessary versus contingent means. That's some of our vocab this week. But their premises will argue that some necessary being exists. And then they're all going to say at the end, and we understand this to be God, right? But there is a big leap from arguing that some sort of necessary being exists to presuming that that is your monotheistic conception of God, right? And so there is even some work to be done still, right? Even if one establishes the conclusion, right, then to prove what type of God it is. So, Lunaria, to answer your question, it's just more of a historic sort of emergence for why monotheistic traditions tend to be the ones engaging in this. Also, to speak specifically to the Abrahamic traditions, we get a lot of our philosophy of religion from the medieval period of human history. And this is a unique moment in scholarship where, especially in this day and age, we see a lot of clashing between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That was not the case historically. So the medieval period is a really unique moment where scholars from all over the world of all different faiths and backgrounds were coming together to try to argue for one God, right? Like they're sort of banded together and say, we have this sort of shared goal here in proving the existence of our monotheism, and then we can work out our differences sort of later on. Right. But so, yeah, it's really just a sort of result of the fact that they were coming later, had competition. And in Eastern traditions, we tend to see more atheistic, right, traditions. Or like I said, if they're polytheistic, it tends to be more from the villages and the areas that those religions just happen to emerge in. All right, good. So let's talk about those categories. I am going to open up. Well, here, there's some other terms before we get to the different arguments for God's existence. Let's check in on some other vocabulary just about beliefs in general. So there were a couple of resources that you all had for belief. But one of the things that I just wanted to sort of emphasize is that belief is not an all or nothing sort of game, right? So you're not a theist or an atheist, like full stop, one way or the other. So I want us to understand that beliefs occur on a spectrum, which is why in science we assess the level of belief in something in terms of probability, right? 0 to 1. Okay, and so we can think of religious belief or any type of belief in the same sort of scale, right? And the idea is that you're never at one point on that scale all the time, right? So you could be you could be a theist and you could just be having a really bad day, right? And maybe your belief goes down a little bit, right? Or you could be an atheist and something really spectacular and unexplainable could happen. And you could possibly be a little bit more open, right, to the idea at that moment. So again, this is a sliding scale, right, of belief. But it is important to denote the difference between these two terms, right, the difference between atheism and agnosticism, right? So I'm going to pause sharing just for a second. If I can return to you all. Are you going to let me do that? No. Stop that for a second. Okay. So I'll come back to that. But so who can tell me the difference between an agnostic and an atheist? And Hannah, if your students raise your hand, feel free to call on them. Otherwise, if you guys on the chat want to raise your hand over the camera or virtually, what's the difference between atheism and agnosticism? You are right. And Lunaria, you've got the other element here as well. Good. right? So it's about how committed one is, right? Or whether or not a belief is actually had. So in philosophy, belief means something very specific. It is a propositional attitude. No, attitude in the sense that when we see a sentence, right, a proposition, we form a belief about it the moment we develop an attitude towards how true or false that proposition is, right? So the proposition we are dealing with this week is a simple one. God exists, right? Or a God exists, or many gods exist, however you want to adjust the proposition, okay? So an attitude towards this would be that it's either true or false, but again, that's not an all or nothing thing. It comes in degrees, right? And so an agnostic is someone who is not taking an attitude towards this. Or in other words, they are withholding belief. So you can actually be agnostic about anything, right? As long as you're withholding belief about something, you're being agnostic about it. We just tend to use, this word tends to come up from religious traditions more prominently. And it's a version of another word that comes up in religious traditions, which is Gnostic, which is a sort of secret type of knowledge, right? That only you can have. So just agnostic, there's just nothing happening, right? So theism, again, is going to be the positive belief, right? The attitude that something is true, right? In this case, that the statement is true. Atheism, again, same idea. We're just putting a negation in front of it. So being committed to the falsehood. So both theism and atheism are beliefs, right? They are commitments to whatever degree, right? Agnosticism is the withholding of belief. Now, you can be agnostic for different reasons and for different lengths of time, right? Just like anything else, nothing is permanent on the belief spectrum. So you could be agnostic just for the time being, right? You could just say, like, I don't currently have enough information to personally make up my mind one way or the other. Or you could be a more of a skeptical agnostic and just say, I don't think it's possible for human beings to know, right? So some people just think that it's just beyond human comprehension, right? Whether or not. So they're just going to withhold belief sort of out of principle, right? So lots of options here. And again, that's the point. When it comes to religious belief, it's not all or nothing. Changes on the daily, right? By the minute, and can change in terms of experience. Okay. Then, of course, there's all the other different types of belief in God. So now I'm going to ask for a little bit more participation from those of you who are online. I'm going to ask you to type it in the chat. And Hannah, if you could get students to share with you what are some different words for different types of belief in God. So the PowerPoint and hopefully some of Anthony's lecture went over. So I mentioned monotheism and polytheism. What are some other types of theisms that there are? Other types of theisms or isms. No, that can include racism. No, we're just doing religion. Types of theism. Deism, very good, Molly. Do you remember what deism is? And you can unmute yourself if you'd like. Rohit, it's a good guess for deities. But any form of theism, most forms of theism are going to refer to a specific type of God in the sense that it is a personal God. Okay, so if you are a polytheist, if you're a monotheist, I'm not going to give away the answers to the other ones, but if you're the other types of theists, you are believing in a personal God. Deism is the belief in a God, typically a singular God, but it is an impersonal God. It is not the kind of God that is involved in the everyday affairs of human beings. It's not the kind of God that, intervenes and performs miracles or that one would pray to. This is the kind of God that is responsible for setting the building blocks for the nature of the universe in place and then they go from there, right? So just an explanation for the creation of things. And so what's interesting about deism is you can find it in every major religion, right? So you could be a Christian deist, right? And just not adhere to the more interpersonal parts of the theology. So good, Lunaria, henotheism is like polytheism, like I mentioned, but when there's a hierarchy. So the Greek system I mentioned is a henotheistic form of polytheism because Zeus is at the top, right? And then the other gods are seen as having a lower status. Good. Polytheism, monotheism, excellent. Pantheism, good. So pantheism, and then there's one very similar to it, but is not the same. Panentheism. Okay, so pantheism and panentheism. I'm going to share my screen again with you to talk about the differences between these two. Okay, hopefully you're able to see this. Okay, I can try to, sorry, they give me all kinds of things here. Let's see if I can zoom in. No, that doesn't want to work. Can you guys see this okay? And I can't see your faces, so maybe you can give me a verbal yes. Does that work?
Yep.
Can you see? Yeah? Okay, cool. Awesome. Thank you. All right. So the difference between pantheism and panentheism, right, is going to be subtle, but important for distinguishing between certain types of Eastern religious traditions like Hinduism and indigenous religious traditions. And so the difference is whether or not God is the same and everything same as everything, or whether or not God is outside of everything and then everything just happens to reside within it. So one way of thinking about this would be, let's see, this is such a terrible example, but this is where my mind goes. So do we all remember you've all seen the Pocahontas film from Disney, right? Do you remember when she's like touching the trees and the animal? Like, that's a very sort of like, right? Perhaps overly simplistic version, but there is something to that, right? Acknowledging the supernatural qualities that are just present within all of nature, right? That would be the same as pantheism, right? Thinking that the divine and the universe are one and the same. So everything in nature is going to be divine, right? But it's one and the same. The divine is not then something in addition to and outside of nature. Whereas in panentheism, yes, the divine is present in everything, but only because everything is sort of housed within the divine. Almost if you were to think of the divine like a womb for the universe, right? It houses the entire universe, but then there are elements beyond it as well, right? It's not only just things in nature which happen to be divine, right? So you might think of panentheism as just postulating something additional above and beyond what also is divine in nature. All right. So pantheism we tend to see in more indigenous traditions. Panentheism we'll see in like Hinduism a lot. We'll see that. Good. All right. So yeah, deism, polytheism, I think those are all the big ones. All right. And so also in the PowerPoint, I kind of give you an overview of some of the major religious traditions so you can get a sense of which types of views they have. But again, the big difference, if we want to generalize, is that we tend to get monotheism in Western traditions, right? Whereas we get polytheism or atheism, right, in the Eastern traditions. All right. Yeah. The polytheists, there's something really interesting about polytheism, just looking at Lunaria's comment here, which is that I mentioned that word anthropomorphic earlier, right? And how much we make gods human-like. Polytheistic traditions tend to make their gods very human, like very fallible, fallible meaning prone to error, right? Very emotional, right? So if any of you know any of the myths from ancient Greece, like it's like they're always throwing tantrums, right? The gods for not getting what they want and punishing humans, right? For, trying to exert their own free will, things like that. And Zeus was the worst. Zeus came down in animal form and sexually assaulted women all the time. It's like documented in a lot of famous paintings, right? So if you see a woman who is engaging in some intimate nude behavior with a bird, it's probably Zeus in a painting, right? And yes, right. And this is really interesting, again, when you look at the history of religious traditions and how they influence each other. So one of the things you see in early, in the beginning of the Torah, right, or the Old Testament, if we're speaking in terms of Christianity, there are a type of being, I think I'm spelling that right, postulated, called the Nephilim. And these are supposedly half angel, half human creatures, right? So this is in the Old Testament, right? And a lot of scholars speculate that this was a way of incorporating the polytheistic elements that were already present in Greek and Roman mythology and making it sort of an easier transition into monotheism, right? So like, oh, you have all these, half humans, half gods. You're just mistaken. It's not that they were half gods, they were just half angels, right? And so reclassifying these sort of hybrid mythos creatures and kind of, I guess what we would call like rebranding them, right? To make it more acceptable to be part of the new tradition. Yeah. So very, very interesting the way they sort of influence each other historically. Good. Okay. So now getting into the different arguments for God's existence, right? Again, I mentioned that we can classify them. Try to share my screen again. Will you work for me? All right, so we can classify the arguments for God's existence in these sort of traditional ways. And here again, the language is going to help us here. So teleos here means function, right? So teleological arguments are those that are going to focus on using something about the way, something that we observe about the way the world works as a reason to establish that God exists. So basically what the titles of these arguments are telling you is what the premises of the arguments are going to be. Okay, so the name, type this in the chat, the name of the argument is going to be telling us what the premises will start with. Okay, so basically, what is the starting point before we arrive at the conclusion that God exists? Okay, so here we're starting off with some observation about the function, the way the world functions, okay, and then reasoning from there, right, using inductive or deductive, hopefully, reasoning, right, to arrive at the conclusion that God exists. Cosmological arguments, right, are going to be obviously about the cosmos, but specifically about the beginnings of the cosmos, or the very first thing that happened. And so those types of arguments are going to be based on like cause to effect, but the other way, right? So instead of reasoning from cause to effect, we are looking at the effect, which is that the universe exists, and then we're reasoning backwards, not just to a cause, but to the very first cause of everything, right? So when people say like, why is there something rather than nothing? Okay, what was that first thing? Lots of people might posit something like the Big Bang, but lots of people might not, right? Lots of people might say that there needed to be something before that, right? Or something to create the stuff that, collided to cause the Big Bang in the first place. Okay, so looking either at the function or looking for the cause of the universe. And then that third type, the ontological argument, is going to be a little bit different because it is not going to be starting off by observing something in the world. Instead, we're going to learn another word here. it's going to be reasoning just from our mind, right? So this is something that is called a priori, right? So if I ask you, like, how do you know 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? You're not going to like go and show me all the 2 things and all the other 2 things. And then, right, you're going to appeal to principles of reason, right? You're going to explain it using your mind. And so ontological arguments are going to be the same way. But again, that name tells us something, ontos, which means meaning. And in this case, the meaning of words, right? And so these kinds of arguments are going to be arguing from the definition of God as a perfect being, right? So our understanding of what God is, right? If we're saying, well, what type of being is this? If we're going to argue that it exists, well, what we mean by God is a perfect being. And from this, they're going to argue that perfect beings must exist. Right? So we're going to have arguments from observation, the teleological and cosmological, and then we're going to have arguments from reason alone. Then we're going to look at arguments that are more practical, right? Okay, maybe it's not from reason alone, maybe it's not based on evidence, but maybe if I just do sort of a cost-benefit analysis, right? If I weigh the odds of, I don't know, potential eternal damnation versus not believing, right? Maybe there could be a reason to believe there. So we're going to be exploring all of these this week, right? And so again, we're going to be assessing the strengths and weaknesses of each of them. And it's not up for me to tell you which ones are good ones, which ones are bad ones, which ones are true, false, right? That's all up for you to decide. But we will be getting to know all of these different arguments this week, right? And we're going to be seeing very sophisticated versions of them, but they're going to be given to us in nice short detail, right? So you're going to see Aquinas's 5 ways, right? Different versions of the cosmological argument. Those are each very brief. You're going to see William Paley's teleological argument, which is told through a short story of the watch and the watchmaker. That's a fun one we'll talk about on Thursday. Okay, so make sure that you get a sense of each of these arguments before you come to class on Thursday so that I can answer questions about right, because there are a lot of different arguments and I want to be able to answer questions you have about them. The last type of argument that you're going to look at comes from more contemporary philosophy, and that comes from someone known as Alvin Plantinga. This is who I studied when I was getting my master's degree. And his type of approach is called reformed epistemology. And the idea here is that he is trying a new way of arguing for the rationality of belief in God without evidence, right? And so contemporary debates have sort of moved away from trying to establish whether or not God exists to instead focusing on whether or not it's rational to believe in God if we don't have sufficient empirical evidence. And so that's what we're going to see at the later stuff. It's really interesting. There's also some contemporary scholars like Laura Buchek at UC Berkeley who argues that it's rational to believe on faith. And she uses an argument by analogy to if you had like a partner who is cheating, right? So if you have, let's say you're dating someone, okay? And the idea is that you're supposed to test if you have faith in the other person's commitment to the relationship, right? Faith in their fidelity, faith that they're not cheating, okay? So now let's say you were given evidence about whether or not the person you're dating is cheating, okay? So Laura Buchek's argument is that if you really have faith in that person's commitment to you, should you look at the evidence? What do you think? Aiden says yes. Even if you have faith, you should still look at the evidence. Carolina, you were sort of saying no, but now you're saying yes? What do you think? Anyone say no? If you have faith, you should not look at the evidence? That's what Laura Buchek argues. So she's arguing here that true faith, right, genuine faith, means not looking at the evidence. Because if you look at the evidence, that means that you are expressing doubt, right? And that you need the evidence to confirm one way or the other. So some interesting arguments out there, right? Again, regardless of where your personal beliefs are, we will be looking at all of them. All right. So we have a few minutes left. Since I'm not there in person, I'm going to just leave those minutes if anyone wants to stay and ask me any questions. But otherwise, I will see you on Thursday in person with your questions about, at least pick one argument that you have a question about. All right. So I look forward to seeing you on Thursday. Have a great rest of your day. You're welcome. Have a great day, you guys. No, there's a lot of debate about this. And so one question you want to ask first and foremost is, are you going to be treating religious beliefs differently than other types of beliefs, right? So most philosophers want to say no, right? They want to say that we should be treating religious beliefs like any other type of belief. And so in that case, most of us feel like in order to be rational or justified in whatever beliefs you're taking, you should at least be responsible for the evidence that you would easily be able to access if you tried, right? So like trying to come up with reasonable standards of like, should anyone be interested in, trying to determine the truth of this proposition, they would have easily been able to access this evidence. And so we're at least going to hold you responsible for that. Right. Yeah, of course. But again, in this case, Laura Buchek's argument was just saying that in cases of faith, we shouldn't need to look at the evidence to check. Exactly. Right. I definitely would always argue for looking for the evidence. Another important distinction, we didn't mention this, but is the difference between faith and dogma. Faith is when you believe something just without any evidence, right? Which is, so a lot of people take many different things on faith. Like I am taking it on faith that my car has not been stolen, right? Like I haven't checked this morning, so I don't have any evidence for that. But right, so there are lots of things that we take on faith. Dogma is the problem, and no philosopher is going to argue that being dogmatic is rational, because when you are dogmatic, you believe something in spite of contrary evidence.
Okay.
Right. So it's a difference between just not having evidence and then forming a belief versus ignoring counter evidence or evidence that would otherwise undermine your belief if you took it seriously.